这是一个实验性频道的节目，记录自我学习的事物。欢迎收听，我也是手札。
Okay, so picture this. You're in Taiwan, right? And there's a typhoon, swirling closer and closer, and you're all cozy at home, safe and sound.
I guess.
And suddenly your phone buzzes.
Oh.
And it's your boss saying, hey, you got to come into work.
Oh, no.
And you're probably thinking, wait a minute, isn't it a typhoon day off?
Yeah, you'd think so, right?
Well, today we're going deep into this whole world of typhoon days in Taiwan, and it is surprisingly tricky, let me tell you.
It really is.
We've got a whole bunch of sources for this deep dive, government documents, news articles, even some economic commentary. And let me tell you, what a lot of people think they know about these typhoon days is just plain wrong.
It's really fascinating, actually, because even the term typhoon day itself, it's outdated.
Really?
Yeah, officially, it's called a disaster prevention day now.
Interesting. So it covers like a wider range of...
Exact. Not just typhoons anymore.
Okay, so first, myth busted.
Right.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
And honestly, a little bit shocking to me. Just because the government, declares a disaster prevention day, shuts down all the government offices and schools.
Right.
Doesn't mean everyone gets the day off.
Yeah, that's a common misconception.
Yeah, I was looking at these Ministry of Labor regulations, and it seems like private companies, they've got a whole different set of rules.
They do, yeah. The government announcements are more like guidelines, really.
Guidelines, okay.
But in the end, it's the private companies themselves who decide whether their employees have to come in or not. And this is actually stated very clearly in the, it's called the Natural Disaster Suspension of Work and School Operations Regulations. It's a bit of a mouthful.
Okay, so hold on a second. That seems a little unfair.
Yeah.
What if my company says I have to come in, even if it's like dangerous to even get there?
Right.
Do I have no choice?
Well, not exactly.
Right.
Luckily, Taiwanese law has this really important protection called the right to retreat.
Okay, right to retreat.
Yeah, so basically it means if an employee feels like their workplace is unsafe because of the typhoon, they have the right to say, no, I'm not coming in, and they can't be penalized for it.
Okay, that's good to know. Puts a little bit of power back in the hands of the employee.
Exactly.
But I'm guessing things get even more complicated, right? Because our sources also mention, labor contracts and company policies.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, while the right to retreat is a great safety net, a lot of the specifics about working during a typhoon really come down to what your employment agreement says.
Okay.
And that's where things get really nuanced, because you have labor contracts, you have collective agreements, you have company work rules. All of these things can come into play.
Wow, so many layers.
There are, yeah. And there's actually a document called the Natural Disaster Occurrence Business Unit Labor Attendance Management and Wage Payment Points that kind of lays out the framework for all of this.
Okay, so if I'm hearing you correctly, the big takeaway for anyone listening who's in Taiwan, you got to really understand what your own individual employment contract says.
Exactly. You need to know your rights and responsibilities when it comes to these typhoon days. Like, for example, your contract might say whether you get paid if you don't work on a disaster prevention day, or it might outline, procedures for working remotely.
Okay, so speaking of pay, what happens if you do go into work during a typhoon? Do you get any kind of extra compensation?
Yeah, that's where the law gets a little bit fuzzy.
Yeah.
If it's a regular work day, the employer isn't legally obligated to pay you extra.
Really?
They're just encouraged to do so.
Encouraged.
Encouraged, yeah.
That's a little vague, isn't it?
It is, and it leads to a lot of disputes.
Yeah, but...
However, if you have to work on like a designated rest day or a holiday during a typhoon, then overtime rules apply, and you might be entitled to double pay.
Oh, okay.
And this is all very clearly laid out in Articles 24 and 39 of the Labor Standards Act.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. What about all the people who are working from home these days?
Right.
If there's a disaster prevention day, announced, do they automatically get the day off?
So if we look at like the legal interpretation and recent court rulings, it seems like the answer is not always. Yeah, the deciding factor is whether the typhoon is actually preventing you from working from home.
Okay.
Like if your power goes out or the internet's down, then yeah, you've got a legitimate reason not to work.
Right.
But if you're safe and your home office is up and running, your employer might still expect you to work.
So once again, it all comes back to the specifics of your own situation and what your employer decides.
Exactly. There's a lot of gray area here.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
And this just highlights how important it is for employers and employees to communicate clearly during these times. Everyone needs to be on the same page.
Definitely. All right, so we've talked about the individual's perspective, knowing your rights, checking your contract, all that good stuff. But what about the bigger picture? What about the impact of typhoon days on the economy?
Right. That's a big debate.
Always seems to be. One of our sources mentioned this tycoon, Lin Bofeng, and he estimates that each typhoon day off costs Taiwan like a whopping 31.5 billion Taiwan dollars.
Yeah, that's a huge number.
That's a lot of money.
And it reflects the concerns of a lot of business leaders who worry about, disruptions to productivity and supply chains.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But then another source we have features another tycoon, Siming Chung, and he's saying, hey, it's not so simple.
Right.
He points out that some sectors might actually see a boost during typhoons.
Like what kind of sectors?
Like think entertainment or online shopping people are stuck at home. They've got to do something.
Makes sense.
And he also brings up a good point. A lot of the work that doesn't get done during a typhoon, it just gets postponed. It's not like it disappears entirely.
It's true.
So it seems like calculating the true economic impact of a typhoon day is pretty complicated. There are a lot of factors to consider.
It really is. There are short-term losses,
Yeah.
potential gains in certain sectors, and then these long-term ripple effects that are really hard to measure.
It all makes you think about that balance, right, between keeping people safe and keeping the economy going, especially in a place like Taiwan that gets hit by so many typhoons.
Yeah, it's a tough question with no easy answers. And as we see, the potential for more extreme weather events because of climate change, this whole conversation is just going to become even more important.
Definitely. Okay, so far we've unpacked the legal side and the economic debate, but there's another layer to this whole typhoon day situation.
Oh, what's that?
The ethical side.
Right.
Even if a company has the legal right to make employees come in during a typhoon, is it the right thing to do? Where do we draw the line between, business needs and employee safety?
That's a really interesting question.
This is where things get really interesting. So let's dive into that next.
Yeah, it really is a question that deserves more attention, especially, as Taiwan is dealing with climate change and the possibility of stronger typhoons in the future. Just because something's legal doesn't automatically make it the ethical thing to do.
Exactly. It feels like there's this tension between what's allowed and what feels, morally right.
Right.
And I imagine this is especially tough for people in jobs where they can't just stay home, even during a dangerous typhoon.
Yeah.
Think about nurses, doctors, emergency responders, people keeping the power on.
Yeah, those are essential workers. We can't just shut everything down,
Right.
But at the same time, we've got to protect the workers who are out there risking their safety to keep things running.
Absolutely. And that's where that right to retreat we talked about before becomes so important.
Right.
It lets those essential workers, make a judgment call about their own safety, even if there's, technically supposed to be at work.
Exactly. It gives them that power.
Now, I'm also wondering if there's kind of a cultural element to this.
Okay.
In Taiwan, there's a really strong work ethic, a sense of duty. Could that make it harder for people to actually stand up for their right to safety, even if it's the law?
That's a really interesting point. It's definitely possible that cultural norms around work, an obligation, could influence how people see and use their rights.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to talk about this more openly, both within companies and as a society.
Right.
We have to acknowledge that tension between the pressure to show up and the need to put safety first.
Exactly. And this makes me think about the companies themselves. What's their ethical responsibility in all of this?
Right.
We know they're not legally required to give extra pay for working on a regular typhoon day, just encouraged.
Encouraged, right.
But ethically, should they be doing more to support their employees who are, braving the storm?
It's a great question, and it brings up the whole idea of corporate social responsibility. Companies are being held accountable not just for their profits, but also for how they impact society and how they treat their employees.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll start to see a change where offering hazard pay, providing transportation, helping to ensure safe working conditions during typhoons becomes the norm, even if it's not the law.
I hope so. I think that would be a really positive step.
It would.
So let's shift gears a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the impact on different industries. Some of the articles you gave us talk about how certain businesses are hit harder by typhoon days than others.
That's right.
Like manufacturing companies, especially those with really complex supply chains.
Yeah, they're very sensitive to any disruptions.
Right.
Even one day of lost production can have a big impact.
Which explains why some companies like TSMC, the world's leading chip maker, by the way,
Huge company.
they might choose to stay open even during a typhoon.
Yeah, they're under a lot of pressure to meet that global demand.
Right. But then you have other industries like retail and restaurants where the impact is a little less clear.
Yeah, sometimes they lose business because people are staying home.
Hmm.
But other times they might see a surge in demand as people stock up on supplies or look for a place to wait out the storm.
It's really interesting how those economic effects can kind of ripple out in so many different ways.
They do.
And as we mentioned earlier, trying to figure out the true cost is really complicated.
It is, and I think it highlights the need for a more nuanced conversation about typhoon days in Taiwan. It's not just about the immediate impact, the losses or gains, but also about the long-term effects on different industries, the well-being of employees, even the cultural norms around work and safety.
So many different factors.
A lot to consider.
It feels like we've uncovered a lot of layers here.
They have.
From the legal stuff to the economic considerations to these deeper ethical questions.
Definitely.
But I think if there's one key takeaway for our listeners, it's that typhoon days are about more than just checking the news to see if you have to work.
Right.
It's about knowing your rights, making smart decisions, and speaking up for both your own safety and a more ethical approach to work during these times.
Couldn't agree more.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree. These typhoon days in Taiwan, they really show how individual rights and societal expectations and even the way work is changing all kind of come together.
It's this perfect storm.
Yeah, it really is. And we can't just rely on old assumptions or think one size fits all anymore.
Right. And as we look ahead to a future, potentially with even more of these extreme weather events, it seems like this whole conversation about typhoon days is only going to get more and more important.
Absolutely. It's not just a Taiwan issue, it's global.
Yeah.
As climate change brings us more frequent and more intense storms, every place that's vulnerable to these kinds of events is going to have to face these same questions.
Right. Like, how do we balance safety and economic activity?
Exactly.
How do we protect those essential workers? How do we adapt our workplaces and our policies to keep up with the changing climate?
All really tough questions.
Yeah. It feels like these discussions need to be happening on so many different levels, within companies across industries, even at the government level.
For sure.
We need to find solutions that work for everyone, not just the people at the top.
I completely agree. And I think a big part of that is raising awareness, educating people about their rights, and really fostering a culture of open communication.
Yep.
Employees need to feel empowered to speak up about their safety concerns. And employers need to be proactive about creating policies that really put well-being first.
It's almost like we need to shift our whole mindset. Get away from this idea that pushing through a typhoon is something to be proud of.
Right.
Instead, we need to recognize that, putting safety first, that's a sign of strength, not weakness.
Well said.
It's about putting people before profits.
Exactly. It's about understanding that a healthy workforce, a resilient workforce, that's what's essential for long-term economic success.
Right. We can't build a sustainable future if we're putting people at risk to do it.
Couldn't agree more.
This deep dive has really been eye-opening.
It has.
We started by debunking those common myths about typhoon days, then we explored the legal side of things, and then got into those really tricky ethical dilemmas.
Oh, many layers.
And it all really boils down to this informed decision-making.
Exactly. It's about knowing your rights, knowing the risks, and making choices that you feel good about. And for companies, it's about taking responsibility. Creating a work environment that puts safety first, that's transparent, and respects each employee's well-being.
So to everyone listening out there, we hope this deep dive has given you some valuable insights into, this whole world of typhoon days in Taiwan.
It's a complex world.
It is, but remember, knowledge is power. The more you know about your rights, the better equipped you'll be to handle these situations and advocate for a safer, more ethical approach to work during these tough times.
And don't forget, the conversation's not over.
Right.
As we face the challenges of climate change, it's more important than ever to stay informed, stay engaged, and work together to build a future where both people and businesses can weather the storms.
Well said. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Stay safe out there.